So tonight we have a special guest, Dr. James Lindsay, and we have been together Monday, Tuesday, today, and we've been in the studio. We've been interviewed by Paris. We've been interviewed locally. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I have been hanging literally on every word. And it has been so enjoyable to listen to Dr. Lindsay. So if you want to start making your way up, Dr. Lindsay, help him, guys, as we welcome him today.
So I'm honored to be here at Candlelight. I'm honored to be in North Idaho with you all. It's Idaho's a state that I've actually had a lot of time in, believe it or not, even though I'm from Tennessee. Just to give you a little bearings on who I am and where I'm from. My experience, I've spoken in 44 states, is that Idaho and Tennessee probably are closer to kindred spirit states more than any other. The Texans can just deal with that. If there's any here, you're welcome. We saved your state. Tennesseans did. You can deal with that too. Just teasing. And I've only really been mostly, I guess, I was in Idaho Falls once with Janice McGeehan, but I also mostly worked in the People's Republic of Boise. And so I haven't made it up to the good part of the state yet. And I'm so thrilled to be up here. And like I said, it's an honor to speak at your church. Pastor Paul and I have got to be very fast friends. Apparently we have a very great deal in common. We think very similarly about many topics, maybe not about all topics. And I'm going to probably now just go ahead and tell you that I'm going to talk about things in your church that you probably haven't heard before. But I'm going to talk about this book, which they told me to bring up as a prop. It is called The Queering of the American Child, which I published on February 29th, the queerest day of the calendar this year, very intentionally. And you can get some hint from this that there's something nefarious to do with sex and sexuality from the queering word, which you probably are not familiar with hearing the word queer as a verb. But that's a thing that the woke do, is they use it as a verb, not just as a noun or an adjective. But then also of the American child suggests that it's something that's happening to our children here in America. And I know from talking to Pastor Paul, I don't have to tell you. Sometimes I do have to tell audiences in places like, similar to, I would say, to North Idaho, that this is happening here. This is happening in your schools. This is happening to your children. But I know that I pretty much don't have to tell you that because this is a more dialed in audience than I normally have the pleasure of talking to. But if you didn't know that, this is everywhere. This is in almost every school district. There are 14,000 school districts in the United States. It is in almost every single school district in America. You are not exempt up here. In fact, I have a low-key theory that it's happening more in Idaho than it is in a lot of other places because I think that they're trying to provoke a violent reaction and can trust people like Texans, Idahoans, and Tennesseans maybe to react that way. Those are three states that they have pushed very hard with this agenda. The Q of the LGBTQ acronym monster, the Q, the queer agenda, which I'm going to separate from, you maybe have heard a phrase, the gay agenda. I'm going to be much more specific. I'm not even going to call it the LGBTQ agenda. I'm going to call it the Q agenda, the queer agenda, because queer theory is the name of the ideology. So this book, the first sentence, I would open it and read it, but I'll probably not get there fast enough. The first sentence of the book says that the schools in the United States are in the grips of a religious cult. And then we define that the cult is the cult defined by queer theory, which is a concept that has come out of academia, arguably starting roughly in 1949, growing slowly, developing, finally being named in 1991 by a woman named Teresa de Lauretis. And then being described in its first full exposition, which I'll talk about in a minute, in 1995, which is about 30 years ago. This has been a fully fledged academic, I was going to call it disciplined, but it's not very disciplined, subject of study, I suppose. A lot of people are not familiar with it. They're in fact not even comfortable with the word. You may be slightly uncomfortable that I've used the Q word a bunch of times, but that is the Q in LGBTQ, which used to be questioning, but they changed it to queer to hide or to stop hiding their agenda. So what I want to tell you about this cult is, first of all, that queer theory is the doctrine of a religious cult. So when you sense that this is a spiritual war, it is in fact a war between two religions. One of these religions is Christianity, broadly speaking, also Judaism. Jews are not really on board with this program when they're actually observant or Orthodox. And queer theory, which is a derivative of Marxism, which is its own broader religion. So I'll help you understand that this is a cult, and it is an alternative religion they're trying to indoctrinate and brainwash our children into, which means it will steal them away from Christianity. And of course, that's very significant. The second thing I want to tell you, of course, is that this cult, by its very name, you can tell, is focused on sex, which means it should not be anywhere near children, even if it were to exist. But of course, they're pushing it specifically. The third thing I want to talk about is that it's specifically targeting children. So you have the doctrine of a religious cult that is a cult based upon sex that is designed to go after our children. And the last big point I want to actually introduce, we're going to go back to that acronym, is that it has very little or nothing to do with gay people, which is the part that's very hard for a lot of people to understand. A lot of conservatives get confused. And when I said that they're hoping to draw a violent reaction, that has a lot to do with what that story is about. They want Christians, they want conservatives to throw a backlash against innocent gay people who did nothing to groom children, to attack children, to sexualize children, to bother children, who are trying to figure out their lives the best that they can. They want people to attack them so that they can create an innocent victim and then point and say, Christians hate gays. And they can build out a narrative saying that Christians need to be regulated, that Christianity is the basis of hate and violence. And then they can come in and say that, well, we have to start monitoring churches, especially conservative churches, especially anti-LGBTQ churches, and you end up with an FBI agent in your church service every day taking notes on everything you do and who knows what else. That's an agenda. So what about this? It has little to do with gay. So let's start with the acronym. You're familiar with this monster, LGBTQ. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans. That one's complicated. We're actually going to talk a little bit less about that one because it's complicated. And queer. That's what those words stand for. Those are not the same thing. In fact, they're nothing like each other. The first three, LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, have something to do with each other. They are people, and it's talking about their sexual attraction. Period. T is complicated. Because there are this kind of, and this is a little weird to say, there's these old school trans. They called themselves transsexuals. That's a bad word in queer theory. You're not allowed to call people that now. And they wanted to just blend in. They understand that they're living a challenging life, and they didn't want to force anybody else to participate. They just wanted to blend in and have the most normal life they can have under whatever weird conditions they have. And then we have this transgender movement that's deliberately targeting our children, that has insinuated itself into our schools, and our schools are actually barely the tip of the iceberg of the problem, because really it's social media that's pulling kids into it, and their entertainment media that's pulling kids in. The big thing with the schools is that while the schools do introduce these topics, that rather than the schools correcting children and saying, let's have us meet, you're saying things that are alarming, we need to sit down and have a meeting with your parents, they're now saying the opposite. We're going to hide this from your parents, we're going to encourage you, and we're going to push you into a medicalization pipeline. So the schools are betraying what they should be doing. So that's the T. It's different because, like I said, the transsexual movement, nobody asked that you affirm them. They did their best to fit in, the best to pass. They struggled with their issues, whatever those underlying issues are. I hope as Christians you pray for those people, that they are struggling. Most of them that I've ever talked to, which is many, know that they are struggling underneath it. So I hope that you have compassion for them, but I hope your compassion doesn't lead you to an incorrect place, that place of inclusion and affirmation that they demand of you as a pair of false values. Because the transgender phenomenon is different. The transgender phenomenon makes you participate. You have to affirm them. You have to recognize it. You have to use their pronouns. In other words, it's not about them and their individual issues that they're trying to deal with the best that they can, which you can look at with disdain or fear or compassion or caring or love or whatever it is that you feel like you need to do for that person. It is now a project of, you will recognize me for who I say I am in defiance of reality, or else you are a bigot who should be excluded from society. And that's a completely different program. That's why I said T is complicated. And then you have Q. Q is something different altogether. But you'll notice that the first three, LGB, had to do with who a person claims or feels that they are attracted to, and T has something to do with who they think they are. It's completely different. It's completely different. Or how they're going to deal with a situation in their lives that they don't know how to deal with. It's not about their attraction. And when we look at the two T's, transsexual versus transgender, transsexual has a little bit more to do with that because they're just trying to deal with their problem in terms of who they are. But transgender, they're trying to force you to affirm who they claim to be in defiance of reality. That's a very different thing. And then you have Q. So queer is defined in the academic literature by a man named David Halperin in the year 1995. I'll give you a little context where this happens before I explain what he says, but it's going to demystify what I just said. David Halperin was writing a book in 1995, or he published a book, I should say, titled Saint Foucault. And now that's already, who, what? Saint, you understand that word? It's a religious word, right? I've told you, this is a religious cult. Foucault is a last name of a French postmodern philosopher and pedophile, and sexual kinkster named Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault probably has more responsibility for creating queer theory than anybody else, and there's a reason, and we can get into that philosophy. Maybe we will in a moment. We'll see how the time works. But what happened was David Foucault was trying to canonize. Did I say Michel Foucault? David Halperin was trying to canonize Michel Foucault in this book, Saint Foucault, where he articulates that what Foucault's big point was. Remember, Foucault was a sexual deviant by every possible way that you could think of it, including interest in boys. He was a gay man. And what Foucault was arguing is that you cannot merely be homosexual. You must become homosexual. It's a political activity. It's not a matter of who you are, and even if it is, that's boring. It's what you do with it. So if you're not a political radical in the name of an agenda, which has come to be known as the queer agenda, thanks to David Halperin's analysis of Foucault, it may have been called the homosexual agenda then, but Halperin's very clear that that's not a clear use of the word. If you aren't politically active in this particular agenda, then you aren't actually doing what you have to do to qualify as homosexual. That was part of Foucault's idea. So it doesn't have anything to do with your state of attraction to one another at all. It has to do with whether or not you are engaging in political activism on behalf of a belief that such people are marginalized or oppressed or treated unfairly in society. You must be a political radical to count under what Michel Foucault considered to be the homosexual, and you must be a political radical, therefore, to be queer in David Halperin's rewrite of this. What David Halperin explains is that when you read how Foucault uses the word homosexual, he specifically is talking about action items related to a political agenda. It is a political identity, which is to say it's not an identity at all, any more than being a member of the Republican Party is an identity. That's not an identity. If that's your identity, you're too into politics. Slow down. It's certainly not, to use the philosophical words or even the Greek words, it's not part of your essence, your ousia. It's not part of who you are. It's something you're doing. And so David Halperin's observation is that this thing he's calling queer, that he draws from the canonization of Michel Foucault, again, a rampant pervert and destructive French philosopher, that what this is some activity. So when you hear the words queer identity, somebody's lying to you. You cannot be queer. By definition, you can only act in queer ways according to what they meant by this, which is a political program. How can we know for sure that this isn't a gay thing? Well, they tell us over and over and over and over again. The definition of queer appears on page 62 of Saint Foucault. He takes a minute to get around to it. 62 pages of waffle before you get to the first point. Let's define the key word, 62 pages in. This is how they write. And you've had to read some, I'll just be very clear, nasty stuff to get that far. They always put that. You know why? Because good people like you, will pick up the book, not this book. Well, there's some pretty choice quotes in here, I'm sorry. And you'll read it and you'll say, woof, can't go any further. So you never get to the point. Because you read something that I will not say in this room 10 times before you get to the point. Halfway or 3/4 of the way through the book. Last chapter a lot of times. And so here's what it is. On page 62, the paragraph where he defines queer finally starts with these 3 words. Unlike gay identity. Nothing to do with it. In fact, after he defines queer, the next thing he says is, it doesn't just apply to gays and lesbians. It can apply to anybody, he says, who is or feels subjective, not is mistreated, anybody who is or feels oppressed because of their sexual practices. So if it's all in your head, that people might not like what you're doing, it's all in your head, you're still oppressed, and this word applies to you. Because the goal is to radicalize you. So here's how he goes on. He says, unlike gay identity, which is rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice, the key words there are not homosexual object choice, they are positive fact. He's not claiming to know, as a matter of fact, where homosexuality comes from, but what he's claiming is it is a fact in reality for these people. It is real, it is there. Positive fact. He says, unlike that, queer need not be rooted in any positive truth or any stable reality. He goes on to say, there is nothing to which it necessarily refers. He says it is defined instead in terms of his fancy word is positionality with respect to the normal. Positionality is a fancy Marxist word that means political stance in a Marxist sense. If you are in the oppressor position or the oppressed position, you have different politics. So your positionality is, are you oppressor or oppressed? Just like the Communist Manifesto. So it is defined in terms of your position politically against the normal. He says, in fact, that queer is, and I quote with italics in the book, whatever is opposed to the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. We can ignore them on the dominant. Everything they don't like is dominance. Is domination, is control. We don't have to pay any attention to that. They're conspiracy theorists. It is whatever is opposed to normalcy and legitimacy, by definition. And then he says it may not have anything to do with being gay or lesbian. And just to give you a fine point, that this is never more than a hair's breadth away from pedophilia. Never more. He says it doesn't just mean gays and lesbians. In fact, it could describe, for example, married heterosexuals without children, because that's outside of the normal expectation. And if you feel oppressed as a result of that, well, there you go. If your mom is calling you all the time, when are you going to have a baby? When are you going to have a baby? And you interpret that as oppression because somebody on TV convinced you to have issues with your parents, well, you qualify. Even if you're in a straight marriage, no big deal. But then he can't leave it alone. He says, or it could even be married couples with children, and I quote, with italics in the original text, perhaps very naughty children. They're never a stone's throw away, or further than a stone's throw away from exactly that. So you need to understand what this agenda is about. So it has nothing in particular to do with gays and lesbians. And in fact, that acronym is designed, I'm going to tell you a story about Mao's China. You think this is a weird diversion, but it's exactly the same program. That acronym is designed for them to hide behind people and use them as human shields. Use them as a front guard to get advancement into things. You don't include gay people. You're a bigot. And you think, well, maybe that's not fair. Maybe I'll be more welcoming. Maybe I'll be inclusive. Everybody should feel like they belong. And then what happens is the radicals, maybe you get 50 normal-ish gay people come in the door and 2 radicals follow behind and they become the problem. If you don't accommodate them, it still doesn't satisfy it. It's still not good for gay people. You're still harming gay people. No, you're not. You're harming 2 radicals who won't agree with anything, but they speak in the name of others. And this is a story from Mao's China. When Mao was taking over China in 1948 and 1949, doing his communist revolution, what he would do, what he would send his CCP army, the People's Liberation Army, to do was go into villages and counties and peasant, domiciles, and he would gather the people there, the innocent people. And let's say he wanted to take on a city like Shanghai. So he wanted to march in Shanghai. So as he marches to Shanghai, every village, every place he goes, he gathers all of these innocent people and at gunpoint makes them walk in front of the army carrying the army's gear. So now you're a nationalist, you're a member of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, and you're fortifying Shanghai, and you have an army of innocent people marching toward you carrying CCP gear, and you fire and fire and fire and fire and kill innocent person after innocent person after innocent person and never hit a single communist because they're behind the innocent people that they're making march. This is how the communists took over China. This is how communists do. This is how evil they are. So I want you to think about it. You've got the Q in the back as a bunch of radical Marxists, and you've got, well, be careful around the T, but just caveat, and the L and the G and the B in front, and they're marching forward, and what they're waiting for is for somebody to flip out about the agenda and start shooting in that direction, and you're shooting the wrong people all the way behind. This is a human shield operation, one of the most disgusting things you can possibly imagine, because meanwhile they're telling those people in front that if you don't join our agenda, those people hate you and they're going to kill you. That's how this grift works. So if you say, I don't think there should be these pornographic books in schools, I don't think there should be a drag queen performing in front of children, I think that's a bridge too far. You know what? I hope you don't have your lifestyle, or maybe you don't care, maybe you're totally libertarian about it, it doesn't matter. Behind closed doors, keep it out of public, keep it away from children. Live your life, be happy, do what you have to do, hope you find Jesus. Whatever you want to say, right? Or maybe even you don't even say the last part. Good for you, whatever, it doesn't matter. If that's your attitude, right? And then you say this crazy stuff is a bridge too far, you are engaging in anti-LGBTQ hate. I have an SPLC profile saying that I am a leader of hate in this country because of that exact thing. Because I said the drag queen phenomenon goes too far and is completely incorrect, so I hate LGBTQ people. So that's, in other words, they're telling them, James is over here attacking the L in the G, in the B, in the T, and maybe it gets to the Q, when in fact all I'm calling out is the Q. They hide behind otherwise innocent people. We can pick other acronyms. You've probably heard of, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. It's a fake acronym to hide behind people. They do this all over the place, but we're going to stay focused to the subject. This is how that works. AANHPI, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. It's like a joke. A Korean, a Japanese, a Chinese walk into a bar. The bartender says, you guys all have the same culture. What happens next? It's a fraud. It's in fact a racist fraud, but we're talking about the sexuality stuff. So that's how you know it's not actually about gay people, and in fact, it's using gay people. Many of whom don't want any part of this. Many of whom are appalled by this. It is not part of their agenda. So I encourage you to start stratifying. If you want to call it the LGBTQ agenda, that's better than calling it the gay agenda. And if you want to call it the queer agenda, then you're actually accurate. Because they're the radicals, and they're the ones actually trying to cause a problem, while most other people are trying to live their lives. So it's a doctrine of a religious cult that is using human shields to advance itself into our institutions so that it can't get criticized, because then you're a hater. Hate, by the way, what does that mean? Does anybody know when they say hate? It means you did something they don't like. Engaging in hate means you didn't give them 120% of their way all the time. They said, I want to do whatever, and you didn't say, not only is that great, you should do more, you hate them. It's a communist trick, it's nonsense, and you don't have to be beholden to that insult anymore, and you don't have to get caught up in it. It's a lie. Okay, so I said this is the doctrine of a religious cult, that it primarily targets children, it's based on sex. I don't think I have to tell you that it's based on sex, I think that's clear. We've covered that it's not about gay people specifically. It's a different agenda, it's a radical agenda. I have the religious cult to cover, but I want to tell you why they target children first. It's very simple. If you heard the doctrine of queer theory as a even moderately or even slightly below average adjusted adult, you would say no. That's the primary reason it targets children, at least for the simplest explanation. You would say no. You would say that's ridiculous. 67 genders? Don't think so. New sexuality being made up every day? Don't think so. Here's my new favorite. I just learned about this one. There's new ones to learn about every day. They have flags, there's colors, it's fantastic. They get a parade. Semi-bisexual. What does that mean? It means they are bisexual, so they're attracted in some principle to both sexes, but they're only actually, because it's semi means half, they're only actually attracted to one. It's a really long word that means straight, but they get to have a flag, and how does that work? How does that work? What it means is that they've adopted the Q radical politics. They've learned to see themselves as a radical that has to upset the normal and the legitimate in society. In other words, they join the religious cult. And here's how this religious cult works. It's fundamentally a religious cult. Here's how it works. They believe, this is going to sound completely crazy. They believe, I have a friend who apologizes. He says, I apologize that I have to say what I'm about to say. I can't help. It is not my fault that they believe what they believe, but I have to report to you what they believe for you to understand it. They believe that every person on earth is actually intrinsically queer. Every single person is actually intrinsically queer. Here's the problem, though. The way that we raise our kids in our families, in our churches, in schools when they're actually responsible in loco parentis, when they're doing what they should, in our communities. The way we raise our kids, in their words, straightens kids out. They're intrinsically queer, but we raise them, we brainwash them to pretend that they're straight, which constrains them in a demand to be straight, to be normal. If they're a boy, to be a boy who grows into a man and grapples for himself with other men and some women as to what that means for him. And if she's a girl, she's born a girl, she grows as a girl, she lives as a girl, and she grows into a woman who has to grapple for herself and with others in her life as to what it means to be an adult woman. That is all brainwashing. It's all a contrivance of evil. And what they have to do is interrupt that process before it begins. And that's why they have to target children. Not just because children will believe it, which is a very practical reason and nobody else would, but because they have to get in to prevent society from straightening out people who are intrinsically a different way. This is actually in a direct parallel to the belief that Karl Marx had, that all people are intrinsically socialist, but the existence of private property and private property ownership fool them into believing that they can be capitalists. We're all actually born socialist. We actually all want to share everything with everybody all the time. We all want to live for each other. We all are guided by our compassion. But we've been fooled by capitalism to believe that we can be individuals. And we have to interrupt that early. That's why it targets children. And let me be very clear that they are targeting children. And that, well, that's a cult, first of all. That was my point. That's a cult, okay? And here's how you can really tell it's a cult and how it targets children. In this book, we quote from a queer educator from 2002 named Kevin Kumashiro. He wrote a book called Against Repetition in 2002. And against repetition means against the repetition of the existing society. We have to not reproduce straight society. He's a queer educator, 2002. 20-something years ago, this was already in education. And what he wrote was that when you engage in queer education, and when you engage in education for social justice with children, it leads children, in his words, into negative emotions like anger, guilt, shame, fear, despair. In other words, he says it drives them into an emotional crisis. Now imagine you're a responsible teacher who actually cares about children and more importantly cares about respecting the fundamental right of parents to direct the upbringing and the rearing and the morals and values education of children. At that moment you would say, whoa, okay, we looked at this and it's a bad idea. We don't do it anymore. That's responsibility. They recognized 22 years ago and wrote it down that it leads children into emotional crisis to do this to children. So what does Kevin Kumashiro say next? He says it is the educator's responsibility to lead children into that emotional crisis and structure the environment around them so they resolve the crisis productively. In other words, it is the educator's responsibility, let's use blunter, less academic words. It is the educator's responsibility to sexually traumatize children so that you can organize their environment to change their mind to adopt queer theory. That's called cult indoctrination. It's actually called trauma bonding. You cause people psychological injury so that they'll adopt the beliefs you want them to believe. You'll notice Christianity does not do that. Christianity does not go around abusing people to get, well, some churches might, but like the Westboro Baptist maybe could have been argued to have done that. But we don't usually get too excited about those people. Christianity, when Christianity is practiced well, does not go around abusing people and saying the only way to deal with this is to join our cult. Accept all of our doctrine. They don't do it. That's a clear distinction between a cult and a healthy religious practice. It's not the same thing. This is what they believe that they should do, and they believe they have a fundamental, inalienable right to use the power of the state through the school to do this to other people's children and to hide it from the loving parents who can no longer be loving parents in that context. And after they hide it, in fact, if the parents object in 20 some odd states, most notably and famously California, to be able to remove the child from the parents entirely, put them under state care, and funnel them into practices like gender-affirming care, social transition as a beginning. 90-something% of children who are socially transitioned at school go on to take puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or both. And once you take that step, you're infinitely more likely, or not really infinitely, many times more likely to engage in the surgeries. And in both of those cases, once you get to cross-sex hormones and surgeries, there's no coming back. You have now mutilated a child, not just psychologically, not just spiritually, but physically, with lifelong consequences that cannot be undone. We're talking about children, other people's children in particular, or your children actually, and the state believing it has a right, an inalienable right to do this, because they know the greater good and the better thing to do for everybody. This is what this book is about. This is what the queering of the American child is about. This doctrine being forced onto your children because you won't believe it, but they are the future, and they can believe it. The book documents, if you're interested, I'm not trying to sell the book, but just to tell you, because I don't have time to go into all the details, at least before we open up for questions, the book documents how this developed, what it really means, what its relationship to Marxism is, how it got into the schools, what the background education theory is called critical pedagogy did to enable this to get into the schools, and how they practice it. I'll give you one quick example of how you can get to a sexual conversation in class where parents will never know it. Very simple, second grade, 7 years old, word problem, real example from the state of Indiana, teacher professional development. I didn't make this up. This is not hypothetical. This is real. This is actually being taught to teachers for how to engage. Here's a math problem. I know you didn't think you're going to do math at church on Wednesday night, but here you go. Buckle up. It's a 7-year-old second grade math problem. There are children in the audience, so I know that somebody's hand is going to go up and get the right answer faster than you. Happens every time. Johnny is riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to an amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They've already driven 30 miles. How much further do they have to drive? Simple. If your child brought this home to you and said, I need help with my homework, and you looked at that, or you thought maybe the school's doing something I don't want them to do, let me check over your homework, and you looked at that, would you see a single problem with that? No, nobody would. Well, it turns out that critical pedagogy uses a concept called generative themes, which are code words that initiate the possibility of a political discussion with children. They are emotionally engaging, exciting, and radicalizing. There are 3 generative themes in that word problem. 3 opportunities to take directions through political conversations. They are amusement park, car, and mom and dad. Totally normal, everyday words. Hey kids, let's do this word problem. Johnny's riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to an amusement park. When you guys do stuff, just curious, how many of you guys do stuff with your moms and dads? Do your moms and dads live together? Is that true for every family? Some kids say, no, I have a single mom. And bang, you get to have a conversation with 7-year-olds about feminism. Or some people say, I know somebody with 2 moms. There's your conversation about sexuality. The door just opened all the way. Amusement park. Hey kids, who's been to an amusement park? Who hasn't? Half the kids raise their hand, half the kids don't. That's called a stratification of the population. A have and have not, oppressor versus oppressed. So you dive in. Wow, some of you have, some of you haven't. That's not fair. Let's talk about, they don't say let's talk about the difference. Let's talk about the difference. Not the math, the difference. And when you go to talk about the difference, what are some reasons why some kids don't get to go? And they're taught, the teachers are taught to prime the students to keep answering. They'll say some funny stuff, they're 7, until somebody says not everybody can afford it. Now you can have a conversation about socialism. Or, my mom won't let me. She says I'm not old enough. Oh, that's not fair. Should parents be able to make that decision? What if we organized a field trip with the school and we could all go? Wouldn't that be more fair? And there you have your conversation about parental authority with other people's children, undermining the role of the family. So that brings us back to why this is a cult, because that brings us back to what the other reason they target children is, which is to sever the tie between parent and child. In other words, to disrupt the family. Communists target 3 things. All 3 things are very important for a reason that I'll close with in a moment. Number 1, they target property. We all know that. They're all about redistributing everybody's property. Secondly, they target faith, because your religion is in the way of them recruiting you into their cult. Of course, children are still trying to figure out where they're going to land in all of that. Third, they're trying to disrupt family. The reason that they have to go after these 3 things is because all 3 are protectors of the soul, and they are actually after the soul. They want to awaken a socialist consciousness in somebody's soul so that they define themselves as socialist or queer or anti-racist, whichever the flavor of the Marxism happens to be. They've got a word for it. They've got a concept for it that you've been dealing with for 5 years now, not knowing what's going on. That's what they're actually after. But they have to split the family. So you introduce sexual topics. I'm semi-bisexual, Dad. You're what? No, you're not. That's ridiculous. You don't understand. You don't understand. It's different now. We learned it at school. I colored a flag. It was pretty. You don't understand. And now you have division. We already talked about the state of California. You create division between the child and their parents. And then Dad, you guys are all at candlelight, so Dad's like, well, in the Bible it says, and then your little Johnny says, old news, obsolete, outdated. Christians are actually oppressors. We learned that in history class. And you've created a sever from the faith. So now you have a child cut from trusting his parents, cut from trusting his faith. 7-year-olds don't have a whole lot of property. In other words, you now have a child who is rootless, spiritually rootless, and you can transform his soul to be whatever form of radical activist you need, whether it's sexual, whether it's racial, or whether it's socialist or whatever else. Again, you pick the flavor, disability status, fat status. You've heard it all at this point. That's fat phobic. You've seen the swimsuit thing. Woof. Woof. Sorry, I had a male moment there. No shade. I'm sorry, I'm being mean. No, I'm just funny. That's the process. That's the project. This is the last question. You know the answer. Who would try to separate children from their parents? The devil's a good answer, but let's be worldly for a minute. I know we're at church. What kind of an organization would deliberately try to cut the roots out from under somebody, including their family and their network of existing friends and support structure? A cult. A Democrat. This thing is a religious cult that is fixated on the idea of self-transformation and self-actualization through believing yourself to be truly in command of self-definition in terms of sex, gender, and sexuality, and that anybody who tells you otherwise is a bigot who is trying to keep you from understanding who you truly are on the inside. That's cult. That's a spiritual statement. It's about the soul, the self-identity of who you are, and they are trying to capture the souls of our children, to confuse them, to break them, to introduce to them concepts beyond their capacity to understand, because those concepts traumatize them and allow them to run the wheel of bringing them further into this cult. That's what's happening in our schools. That's what the queering of the American child is. And they deliberately, one of the last chapters in the book is deliberately about the fact that they've written a guide, a professional guide called Navigating Parental Resistance, so they can know how to get around it when you don't like it. That's cult behavior as well. So I want you to understand that not just queer theory, but Marxism writ large, including critical race theory as race Marxism, queer theory as sexual Marxism, blah, 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 whatever identity you want, all the identity politics, is the largest cult startup in human history. Add in climate change, add in the rampant hatred of conservatives as deplorables and despicables or whatever other word they come up with, add in the everything, I don't know, did I say COVID, climate change, and the kind of worldly politics where it's literally based on hate and identity based in hate. This is all the largest cult startup the world has ever seen, and they're after your kids. And our job is to stop it. So how do we stop it? Well, we'll maybe talk Q&A. The nitty-gritties are hard. Let me give you 2 real quick points to get you started. The first thing you have to know is that this is a deliberate attack. This isn't just happening. A lot of the people participating in it are well-meaning people who don't know what they're doing. They are servants of an evil ideology and don't realize it, so you cannot approach with malice and hate. Jesus says, when I send you out as sheep among ravening wolves, I send you to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. Gentle there includes the concept of harmless. When you look up the Greek, you can't absolutely go on the attack against these people because many of them are innocent tools of this agenda. They're the people marching in front of the communists, pushing them forward, and you have to help them. They are victims of the cult too, and victims become perpetrators. So you have to understand that this is being done deliberately and approach it with wisdom and with the grace that comes with your Christian practice. Absolutely necessary. The second thing you have to do, unfortunately, and again, I promise, I'll put it where you can't see it. It's not a sales pitch for my book. You don't have to use my book. I have podcasts too. You need to understand the language. You need to understand when they say inclusion, it doesn't mean what you mean. You need to get educated. Sun Tzu, who you might call Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, said that if you know yourself and the enemy, you need not fear enter any battle. But if you only know yourself and do not know your enemy, for every battle you win, you'll lose one. And if you know neither yourself nor your enemy, you'll lose every battle you enter. You need to know yourself as Christians, as Americans, constitutional basis of our country, the founding principles, that none of us have the authority to brainwash or push around or delimit the conscience of another. We can't rob somebody of their life, liberty, or property in this country because that would force them to believe something possibly that they don't want to believe. You need to understand yourself. You need to get square with your gentle as doves and wise as serpents. Discernment, Charles Spurgeon said, is not the difference between knowing right and wrong. It's the difference between right and almost right. It's got to be good. So you've got to get educated. You've got to be sharp. It looks almost right. Don't take the wrong road that's almost right. They say 3 right things and 2 wrong things. It's still 2 wrong things. You've got to get it right. So you've got to learn some things. And then you have to know your enemy. So you have to know how they think. You have to know how they talk. You have to learn to recognize these manipulations. On a more practical level, those are 2 things, by the way, that you need to do. On a more practical level, what you need to do is protect your children at all costs. Their model is that if they get the colleges of education, then they'll get the teachers. And if they get the teachers, then they'll get the kids. And if they get the kids, then they get the future. There's one thing standing in between them and the future, which is the parent. Squarely between teacher and child and future is parent. Right there, hovering over the child in that chain is the parent. It is your job to protect them. That may very well mean that for some years to come, you homeschool your children. You figure out how to make it work to protect them from this agenda coming in from the government. And actually, private schools are mostly worse because they try to get kids to go to Harvard, which is super deep into this. Don't think private schools are a free pass. It's not that easy. Even if you get school choice, you're still going to have to look at every single school to find out if they're doing it under the radar. So you need to protect your kids. Just in parallel, since I'm in a church and I know the pastor will appreciate it, they have a second plan that's the same plan. If you can capture the seminaries, then you can capture the clergy. And if you can capture the clergy, then you capture the laity. And if you capture the laity, then you capture the soul of the nation. And the same program is playing out in churches, not just the churches that fly the flags. Not just the churches that, I went to Cape Cod recently and American flag, American flag, American flag. I was shocked. I'm in Massachusetts, American flags everywhere, except on the churches, pride flags. Except on the churches. It's not just the churches that are lost. This idea of love your neighbors who do ridiculous things is a perversion that's made it into many, even conservative churches that are confused and caught by the spirit of evil. And it's your responsibility to catch into that gap as well and help those people come back to discernment and wisdom and biblical truth and actually just common sense. You don't even need to get into the Bible for you. Just common sense. Don't do this in children. And if you stand between your children and this monster, and if you stand between the soul of the nation and this monster, I can't promise you that you win, but I can promise you can sleep at night. I can promise you that when you think about looking your child in the face or your grandchildren in the face, if this all goes wrong, that you can tell them, I did every single thing I could, and I hate that it didn't work, but I tried my best every day. And if you don't, you're going to have to answer to them. But even worse than that, you're going to stand on Judgment Day and you're going to answer to somebody else. Because in the book of James it says, James chapter 4, it says, for he who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, it is a sin. I hate to tell you that you now know what you're facing. It's not ambiguous why this is wrong to you anymore. It's not ambiguous what its goals are. Its tactics, I'm not selling the book, can be learned. Therefore, you know the right thing to do. You have to figure out how to stand up with wisdom together, helping each other learn, showing up to meetings and speaking with calmness, with clarity, in clear words, and backing each other up. So if you decide to go speak at the school board meeting and say, I don't like this, 10 of you need to be going with him to clap when he finishes talking, just to prime you for the next minute. It sucks when you talk and nobody claps for you. So back each other up, love the country, love your children, love your faith. Get as accurate in knowing yourself and the enemy as possible, and you're going to make right decisions. And you don't have to worry about the details. Continue to work on getting educated. This isn't the forum for the details. Thank you for letting me come give you this overview and get you started. We'll take questions until you kick me out. This is a very easy book to find. We made a website for the book itself. It is queeringbook.com.
How can parents recognize this in their schools? What questions should we be asking our children?
So, yeah, actually, that's one of the best ways to recognize this in a school, given that they're going to hide it from you in the way that I kind of explained with that word problem. And in fact, if you show up to see if they're doing it that day, they probably won't do it. They're not that dumb. The best thing you can actually do is as you learn this material and you start to learn words like, well, first of all, let's start in common sense before we get to the Marxist words like inclusion and whatever, or any of the weird sexuality words or gender or lessons or anything like that. Just common sense. Do you have adults that are telling you to keep secrets from us at the school? Do you have adults who are talking about things that make you feel uncomfortable because they talk about things that your mom and dad might not like? You can have very young children who turn into absolute espionage grade spies that will go find out if these things are happening and bring this back to you, and then you can have those conversations. One of the things when I say protect your children, you need to be, I know it's difficult to be a parent at all times. It's more difficult to be a parent now, but it's more rewarding because you need to be engaged with your children all the time. The saying is, of course, that you need to prepare the child for the road, not prepare the road for the child. We would love to bulldoze this off of the road, but at the present, it is on the road. So you need to start to teach your children, not the gross stuff, not all that, but you need to teach them to recognize when they are being presented with something that maybe draws into these topics, some of the maybe the easier keywords that they might bring up, which you'll learn as you go, and then actually, especially, do you have adults at your school asking you or other children to hide things from their parents? And if the answer is yes, you're in an immediate conversation. You need to be talking to the principal. You need to be talking to the teacher, and you can train your little spies. What I've talked to parents all over the country who are fighting back and who have gotten active and have started to learn a lot about this. And sometimes they know more than I do on certain parts of the topics. What I've found is that they've got their little trained army of children that they send off to school, 2, 3, 5 kids, whatever they got. They send them off to school, and then every single day, the drive home from school, or, when everybody's home for the first time having the snack, they start talking and laughing about the different things that the teachers tried to pull on them and how stupid it is and how there's no way it was going to fool them. But yeah, some of the other kids are getting pulled in. But the best way to do that is to teach your children to, A, within the boundaries of common sense, or people asking you to lie to your parents or hide things from your parents, and then B, as you learn some of the lingo, sexual topics, whatever it happens to be, teach them to come home and immediately tell you if any of that stuff happens, and make sure that they know every single day that you love them, that you want them to have the best experience in life, that you accept them, that they might be told things that lead them to think otherwise, and if they do, you need to be brought into it immediately because you want to fix it because you're their mom, you're their dad, and you love them. If you do that, your children will turn into little spies for you, and you'll find out what's going on in the school better than you ever could through some outside, let's try to find out the curriculum, let's FOIA the school or whatever method. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Get really involved with your children, have real age-appropriate conversations about the things that they might be introduced to. Look up curriculum for this kinds of topics. There's lots of people who are publishing on this on the more granular level than I do. Find out what kind of things they're teaching to third graders. Start asking your kids, do they teach any of this stuff in your school? Kids will tell you if you have a good relationship. So make sure you get that relationship there and keep it good too. You'll have your spies.
Amen.
Yeah, social emotional learning, by the way, which is in your school
Definitely.
period, does this always.
Yeah.
First off, thank you. Very well covered. We see a cycle, in my opinion, from the 70s on steroids, where we're coming back around again. That being said, one of the shifts within school systems was to social studies instead of civics. How can we engage, in addition to the child level or the grandchild level, how can we engage the school boards to do something like the Heritage Foundation, where we can re-engage at a civics level and be involved for us into society? How do you recommend that?
I mean, the basic policies for actual civic engagement are going to be things that are going to be very frustrating. So my first piece of advice is actually lower your expectations. I don't know if you ever watched the movie Shawshank Redemption, but when he wanted to build a library, he wanted to get some money, so he decided to write a letter every single day to the state legislature until they gave him some money to make a library for the prison. And then when they told him no, he started to write 2 letters a day every day until they gave him the money for the library. And then the money started to come in for the library, so he started to send 3 letters a day. And so what you have to have is a lot of persistence. You're going to find a lot of resistance at first, so you're going to have to persist through that. I think it is actually pretty biblical that there's going to be forbearance in your challenges. You're going to have to make the sacrifice of the additional time. Conservatives have a big problem of being respectful, by which I mean you ask, they say no, you say, oh, they said no. Have you ever seen what happens when the left is told no? They get upset. Well, that's a word for it. They fall on their knees, no, the whole thing. So you have to have a lot more, I don't encourage you to act that way, but I encourage you to have a lot more persistence. But start writing letters that are well worded on the topic of concern. Start showing up to meetings and using your 3 minutes whenever you get the chance. Try to schedule lunch with some of the sympathetic members of the school board. Sit down, take them to lunch, talk to them, tell them your concerns, show them what you're talking about, show them the curriculum, see if you can get them interested. And then same thing if you can reach your state legislator or even the congressman that represents you and do similar stuff. You are their constituent, so if you request a meeting enough times and you're friendly enough about it, they probably will eventually accommodate you to some degree, or you're going to have a really funny story to tell every time you talk about how they run away every time you try to talk to them. Catch them in public, don't be rude, try to talk to them. You've just got to kind of become that advocate. That's what the left has done very successfully, is become organized advocates, and I encourage you to do the same. But this is why I advocate for homeschool. I, honest to gosh, don't see gosh. What's gosh? Gosh is what you have to believe in, otherwise you go to heck. You wouldn't want to be danged.
Well said.
I lost my train of thought with that. But honestly, what you have to realize is that the schools are not about to fix themselves. They're going to be one of the long-term battles that we're fighting, which, by the way, if you have children or grandchildren in school now, is a very bad bit of news for you. I encourage you, though, to look the state of Utah to your south. A friend of mine to a degree as far as legislators go named John Johnson, Senator John Johnson, put forth legislation in the last session there. This was for universities, but it's still a model where he tried to get the core curriculum of the university education to have to be by law in a state university to fit very specific parameters. You can look at that model legislation with your legislator or send it to your legislator and start asking questions. How do we go to a robust civics education? How do we get this looking like what it used to be for our schools, which builds good American citizens again? And other than that, I have to tell you that the rule of liberty or freedom is it's a sword that cuts both ways, right? So, of course, freedom is the freedom to be able to choose to do good. You're not just obedient because some power told you you have to. It is the ability to choose it to do good for yourself. So it turns out that freedom and responsibility are tied up pretty tightly together. Responsibility is also the measurement of how much freedom you should be able to have. It's how much freedom you can handle. How responsible you are in your life is how free you get to be. If you can handle all your stuff for yourself, and you can be responsible, then you get a little more license in how you can behave because you're going to be able to do it right and maintain your responsibility. And you won't have bad consequences that land on other people. So what does that mean? You have a responsibility to do this education for your children, for yourself. Your role as a parent is that you have the fundamental right, thus responsibility, for the upbringing, education, medical treatment, etc. of your child until the age of 18 and how you deal with it after that. And therefore, you got to take the reins in your own hands, and you've got to say, I know you don't like extra school, but we're going to have civics education. Make it as fun as you can. We're going to learn about the founding fathers. We're going to learn about how this country was organized. We're going to learn about why we have divided powers. What does that mean? We're going to talk about the Constitution, and you're going to get your children literate, and it's your responsibility whether the school's doing it or not. And if you find out after 6 months of this, and I'm like, gosh, this takes a lot of time. They go to school, then I have to deprogram them, then I have to educate them. Maybe I should just take them out of the school and stop wasting 7 hours a day. Then you'll make a better decision about what to do next. 8 after you deprogram them. So it is ultimately in the short term also your responsibility. If you want to be the light that drives out the darkness, when you go to talk to your legislator or the school board and you say, I do this with my child, or maybe neighborhood kids get together and we do this, and this is the effect, and this is the result, and these kids are engaged. How do we get this in the schools? You're going to be more persuasive too. You've become a brighter light to shine into that darkness. So I encourage you to remember that we're Americans, and when the government ain't doing it for us, we do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about how queering is a cult, and so often as we see, it's hard to bring people out of a cult, or especially family members. So what are practical ways that if we have family members, not only children, but also college students or even older family members that are part of this queering cult, what are practical ways to help them come out of that? I know praying for them is obviously one way, but I think there's more practical because they're not going to want to hear the Christianese or the Christian side of things on that.
Yeah, that's actually a point, by the way. If they've been pulled partway into this cult, the more Christianese you throw at them, the worse it's going to work out. That's a negative feedback loop that got set up against you. So not to tell you not to do it that way. I know you got your beliefs and they have to come first. I'm just telling you that you might expect a backlash if you do that, and it's going to be frustrating. In a practical sense, actually, though, Christian practice, which you don't have to use a word of Christianese to do. You don't have to say a single Christian belief, but you have to practice what the Christian religion is, actually gives you the right model for how you deal with cult deprogramming. And I'm going to warn you, this is not fast or easy. As somebody gets pulled in, I've worked with a very large number, well, not that large, but a not trivial number of these detransitioners who transitioned and now have returned to living their lives authentically. And to a single person, they have told me a number of things that are so congruent from one to the next that it's amazing. And one of them is that even after they decide, I'm not trans, that was a mistake, it's 2 years before they get themselves back squared up. That's how long it takes to uncult yourself, is about 1.5 to 2 years for most people. It is a process. It is a worthwhile process. You are protecting and saving your children, so you have to do it. You have to dedicate the time. But I want you to have your parameters set to realistic. Okay, deprogramming's hard. But here's how you actually deprogram. Most of the time, you are not going to have the power to initiate the process, but sometimes you will. The process always gets initiated by somebody that's in a cult recognizing that one of the beliefs that they have in the cult isn't real. And they suddenly have a state called cognitive dissonance. Social emotional learning, by the way, is designed, in the words of UNESCO, in order to overcome cognitive dissonance in children when they engage in this educational program they're being put through. So they are programming them. You want to be the person that finds them in that situation where they've seen a lie, where it's not working, something isn't adding up, something doesn't fit. You can get there by telling them the truth, by being very forthright with them, by actually telling them this is a belief. You're in a cult. Listen to how you won't even hear another opinion. That's cult behavior. And then let them go stew on it for a while. They're going to get mad at you in the moment. Let them stew on it. But then what you need them to know, and this is the Christian part, think about how churches work. There's not a single person out there in this community, I'm willing to make a bet on your church, there's not a single person out in this community who, if they wanted to seek what's here, that they wouldn't be welcome to come in this door and listen and try to find answers for their life.
Amen.
In other words, the church is a landing pad. Christian practice is that you are a landing pad for somebody who needs to find truth, right? So you need to tell people with love that this is incorrect. You need to know where I stand, but I also love you and I welcome you in. Anytime you have questions, anytime you want to talk, anytime you want to find answers and go deeper, and I promise you, this isn't a Bible, I promise you I won't beat you over the head. I promise you I won't go any further than you ask. So when they ask you a question, you answer the question as truthfully as you can. And if they don't ask you a question again, a second question, you don't answer anymore. You don't tell them anymore. And you let them come out piece by piece. Let them think about it piece by piece. Tell them the truth. Let them ask questions. And you can ask them a question or two. Ask them if they might want to ask anything else or if they've had enough. Be very compassionate with the process. But let them know you're welcome back anytime. But it's like the prodigal son. You don't just get to come back willy-nilly on your terms. We're going to have to work through the deception or the problem in your life. This is where I stand. I will not accommodate or enable it. But I am more than happy to help you find healing from what's pulling you in this direction, and you can always call on me. You can always trust me to listen. You can always trust me to treat you with care, kindness, and compassion when you do. But I'm also not going to compromise principles and drag you into further harm. Amen. And when they know that that's who you are, and I know this to be the fact because it's happened to me many times, is that people will come up to you and they know who you are in that way, and they'll whisper to you. They'll say, "Can I tell you something? I can't do the pronoun thing anymore." And they'll cry because they've never been able to tell a single person they can't do pronouns anymore, and you're the first person. So you want to be that person, and how do you do that? How's the church supposed to work? Be like that. That's it. It's the whole story. This is actually a way that you pull people out of a cult. But by asking them gentle questions or letting them see or being there for them when they see a contradiction and then helping them answer that with truth rather than being pulled back into delusion is how you help somebody slowly cult deprogram. They have to know you are a safe person to talk to who will not judge, who will not fly off the handle, who won't call them names, who won't laugh at them, who won't belittle them, but who will try to tell them the truth to the best of your ability with love and in the hopes that you can, bring them to a better understanding of what they're going through for themselves, and then let them have the space to do it stage by stage. It's like I just gave you how to pastor.
Very good.
Other than the WHO or the White House, is there a headquarters that is making the rules or, for this
Good.
a cult?
Yeah, okay, so this goes as high up as you want it to. I guarantee you it's happening. I'm just going to give you a little, this won't answer your question directly, we'll get there. I guarantee you there's something at the local governance level that's pushing this, at least some people, if not the entire board. I guarantee you when you get to the state level, even here in Idaho, there are people who are pushing this.
2 of the school board members are members here.
Well, then you should
So
be
we got.
You should be a thorn in their side.
Yeah.
I guarantee you
Thankfully.
that the federal government, I know, we all know the federal government is not only doing this, but they're trying to change the rules around discrimination legislation to force schools to do this. Money is tied up. The CARES Act money is tied up with doing social emotional learning, for example. That's out of the COVID money. For whatever reason, they have to do this program in order to get it. The ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act from 2015, thanks Obama, is geared up that you have to be doing measurements of non-academic competencies, which include social and emotional competencies, that you can't get federal funding if you're not checking off those boxes and proving that you're doing activity pointed in that direction. So this goes all the way up to the federal government. There are a lot of nonprofits that are pushing this. I mean, the Human Rights Campaign is probably one of the more significant ones. They publish a series of scores that extort entities to make them do this agenda. The Corporate Equality Index forces corporations to do it. The Healthcare Equality Index forces hospitals and medical facilities to do it, which increasingly through the community schools model would include schools with their clinics and their counselors. And then there's something called a Municipal Equality Index that forces municipalities like cities and counties to do this as well. So this goes all the way up even to an international nonprofit like the Human Rights Campaign, but the biggest, there are others, SICAS, Planned Parenthood, and so on that are all involved. The biggest international organization doing it is UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The thing called Comprehensive Sexuality Education, that is actually the vehicle for most of this, is a UNESCO invention in 2003. I talked to a man in November. I went to an international conference in London. I talked to a man from Kenya who said this is in Kenyan schools. I talked to a lady from Poland who said it's in Polish schools. I've been in Canada, it's all over Canadian schools. I talked to somebody in London, it's in British schools. I talked to somebody in France, it's in French schools. Why on earth is it in Kenyan schools that they're doing this to Kenyan children? It's because it's a United Nations global project to introduce these concepts and thus the value, the false value of inclusion on their definition to children all over the world to create a world religion. But UNESCO, which Donald Trump took us out of while he was president and Joe Biden put us back in immediately when he took office, UNESCO is the primary purveyor of this particular ideology in education. And so it is a major international effort that's written major international standards. Of course, Common Core could be located as tied up with that. A lot of people know of Common Core and the controversy with the governors, but it actually is a derivative of something called the World Core Curriculum. The World Core Curriculum was created by a weirdo religious freak called, not Christian, like a total New Age guy called Robert Mueller, not that Robert Mueller, different Robert Mueller, weird name, I know, who was a United Nations bigwig. And the Common Core Curriculum was actually a United Nations project to transform education to all be on one page across the whole globe. So if you want one big monster for this, I would point to you and say that the big monster that you're looking at is the United Nations. I'll also tell you that the CCP is funding this worldwide and in the United States in particular to make sure that this is in education but also in media. So this is a global problem. This is normally where you panic and think there's absolutely nothing you can do about this. And that's where I remind you that you are the parent that has the fundamental right to direct the upbringing and education of your children, which means that you can put your children behind you by getting them out of the schools and homeschooling them, and then those tentacles can't touch them there. And I was a public school kid. I wasn't a homeschool advocate until like 2 years ago when I realized that our schools are stuck for 20 years. And that means the only kids who are going to have hope are going to get homeschooled or inoculated by parents who know how to do it before they go to the indoctrination centers.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the extreme example of California and how the schools are removing parental rights and steering children into the medical industrial complex. Are you seeing that as a pattern across the United States? Is that increasing, or is that an outlier? And what can a parent do at that point once the child has been in that extreme situation, is now a ward of that medical complex?
Okay, so is California an outlier? Let's be honest, yes. It's better not to think of it as an outlier, but to think of it as the test bed. The program starts in California, they figure out what works and what doesn't, then they outsource it to other states. It is in, I don't remember the exact number, over a dozen states that are coded blue on the electoral map have adopted these kinds of things in great similarity, not just California, not just Oregon, not just, by the way, Washington, which is just right over there, right? I don't know which way it is, but it's right over there. And technically, they have one of these so-called trafficking laws, right? They have one of these trafficking laws where if some kid here in Coeur d'Alene runs across the border, which they probably could physically do on their bike or something, and declares sanctuary from their parents, they're a ward of Washington now. They have one there. They have this in Minnesota. They have this in, I think they've done it in Maryland. They're doing it in almost all the states that are heavy-duty blue. And so that will try to go to all the states if they can get the legal chops to do it. And I think you understand the rhino and the other corruption problems in the Republican parties, and that our states aren't safe by default of being coded red. So yeah, this is happening, and yeah, it's being exported, and yeah, it's everywhere. What do parents have to do when this comes up to be the case? Find a really, really good, very expensive attorney and try your luck in court, lose at the local level, and hope you can win at the appeals court and drive this case to the Supreme Court, which is like a nightmare situation, which means you don't have good options. And there are people who are in tragedy all over this country who have lost their kids for extraordinarily small things, like refusing to affirm, a 3-year-old boy in a dress that mom is putting him in, and it's like really just a fight between the couple that's playing out through that, and then whoops, dad loses his parental rights. That's a real story of a man named Adam Vina that I know in Los Angeles, so in California. So he's had no recourse. He's tried in the courts, and it's only made his matters worse. This is a doomsday scenario for parents, which is why it's so important to protect your kids from getting pulled into the vortex in the first place. Because in these states that have those laws, you're up against something that until a superior court with an extraordinarily expensive lawsuit to get there, multiple lawsuits actually to get there, until they say something otherwise, you have no legal recourse, and you're going to watch your kids get thrown into the gender blender by a state that doesn't just not care about them, but needs them to be fodder for a revolution that destroys everybody's life if it succeeds. And it is a horror show. So I don't want to end on such a sour note. But the fact of the matter is, we are this close right now, this close to losing everything that this country is about. And so Christians don't vote in large numbers. They have the lowest voting turnout. Oh, it doesn't matter, it's in God's hands, or it's all rigged anyway. Shut up and vote. Get your friends to vote. Get this information out, start spreading it. This is tipping over. So here's the positive. Let's put some light after that dark tunnel. This is tipping over in Europe quickly. People in the United States in power are noticing that it's tipping over in Europe. The bodies, the medical associations and so on that are pushing this, like WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, is falling quickly into disrepute, which is going to cause the American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, blah, 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 or pediatricians, I forget which one it is, to fall into disrepute. On down the line. This is something that we can win if we continue to have calm, direct, truthful conversations with people, show them the evidence. The overwhelming majority of people agree with us. The overwhelming majority of people just are too afraid or think they're too alone to start speaking up about it. They don't want to offend, and they need to realize it's time to start talking. And we can actually change this. This nightmare scenario can end up where somebody who's been robbed of their parental rights will end up in court and will win. But it's our duty to make that knowledge spread like a wildfire so that the judges and the judiciary start to learn what's really going on here. I mean, what's going on right now is a First Amendment violation writ large in our schools. We have government schools teaching the doctrines of religious cults that are explicitly religious cults that we can't file a First Amendment suit to stop because nobody knows how to classify it as a religion adequately. What's that? That's an education problem. So speak up, start telling the truth, start showing people what's really going on. They won't believe you. If you want an example of a person doing this, I have a friend, he goes by Billboard Chris. Billboard Chris, look him up. He's very famous. He's changing the world. He's one man having thousands of conversations about this, and he is a role model for how to have these conversations. He will make you very clear on how to speak to normal people about this issue and make a difference. He does it all day, every day. Look him up, Billboard Chris. Fantastic role model. And we can stop. This is the greatest child abuse scandal in human history, and we can stop this. But it takes the courage to speak up and the willingness to do a little bit of homework to get clear on the issues and learn how to speak about them to people in a compassionate and clear-headed way.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome.
Thanks, Pastor. Do we run away now?